Now we're going to look at what, when we put into these models, what changes different treatments have as an example about how the main tools that we use in salinity management, what impact they'll have. So if we do nothing, as you've seen just before, we're going to go from 4,000 hectares of salt-affected land, or more correctly 4,000 hectares with a shallow water table, and we're going to increase that by another 4,000 hectares out to 2030. So if in the future from here to 2030, the rainfall and the wind of rainfall in particular has reduced by 20%, of that 4,000 hectare growth, we're only going to achieve an additional 800 hectares of salt-affected land. So we're up, if you like, or we're better off by 3,200 hectares. However, if we revegetated 2/3 or 66% of all the uplands in that catchment where the water tables were deep, we would only reduce that final area forecast with a shallow water table by 900 hectares. In other words, we would have 7,100 hectares with a shallow water table. And we'll come to that, why that actually is the case in a minute. The main reason is that all the valleys with the shallow water tables are not revegetated in that example, and they still continue to fill. If we were to establish deep-rooted vegetation over the full coverage area, and I don't mean trees, I mean something that would have a perennial base to it, something which might look like lucerne on the better soils, it might look like tagassasti, it might look like some of the grazing forage shrubs, it might look like saltland pastures in the lower areas, we would or could reduce that extent similar to a rainfall reduction by 20%. The problem at the moment in that particular example is we're yet to develop that full suite of perennials to cover most of the soil types for this wheat belt. So currently, while the CRC Future Farming Industries is busy trying to walk through and forecast and develop these particular planting systems, we currently don't have them for most of the soil, so it's not an option that we can deliver. The other option is, which is popular, is drainage. Now here we've covered a drainage option where we have drains at their optimum spacing for this particular soil type, which in this case is very tightly gridded. And here, similar to some of the others, we can manage or reduce the future extent to some degree, or rather we don't change the current extent and we only reduce the future extent by 100 hectares. And that's pretty much because you can only put drains in when the water tables are shallow. And our model marker here is a water table reduced by 1 metre to 2 metres, and that doesn't change a lot in this particular catchment. And the reason for that is this particular catchment has pretty heavy and tight clay soils. One drain down the middle only reduces the forecast area out to the future by only 500 hectares because it is only one drain down the middle of the catchment. You'll also see that surface water management has very small impact, and that's because there's enough winter rainfall to keep these water tables charged up, and it makes only a small element of difference to the water tables. It might change the severity but doesn't change the extent. Finally, with saltland pastures, we see the only example of a treatment system where not only do we change the potential future forecast, but we actually get some land that's currently salt affected back to having a deep water table. Now it's a bit like, this example is a bit like the deep-rooted vegetation. It's an example where if we had the pasture species to cover all of this sale on land, that particular example would be realistic. But there is still some development work that's required to get what's in a numerical model or a plastic estimate into reality. So the summary for this particular model run, if we go backwards, you can see on the left the water tables are shallow where the red areas are, and on the right you can see that that area of shallow water table grows to the south, it grows up all the creek lines and arms of the catchment, and at the moment we have very few tools that give us capacity to stop the left-hand one turning into the right-hand one. I think probably for many of you, the question is, why didn't the trees do the job when you planted 66% of the landscape? So let's just look at that very quickly. Across the last 20 years, we've monitored 80 sites around the agricultural area, looking at revegetation and how it's affected water tables. Those results are published and are accessible after this talk. I'll just look at one example because it's just recently been reported. For 4 examples that Don Bennett, a colleague of mine, has looked at for oil mallee systems across the wheat belt. These 4 sites have been at Marchagee and Goodlands in the northeastern wheat belt, at Tincarron in the central, and at Gibson out near Esperance. So there in the bottom right-hand table are the statistics of those sites. Marchagee with 300 hectares, oil mallees at 4% coverage, and natural and the other existing vegetation at 5%, so a total of 9% of that catchment. Goodlands with a total of 8%, Tincarron with a total of 12%, and Gibson with the most vegetated with a total of 28% in perennial vegetation or in trees, of which between 4 and 10% of that total was in oil mallees. Let's move on to the response in groundwater levels. These sites vary in their establishment date, but Marchagee, let's look at that one, established 2000. Bores under the oil mallee system dropped 7 centimetres a year, exactly the same as they dropped under the comparison sites where there were no vegetation. And in this landscape, the area of vegetation was relatively small, and climate or the lack of rainfall controlled the response. In Goodlands, planted 1995, so now 15 years old, the oil mallee system, again, not covering a high proportion of the landscape. Its rate of rise, in fact, at this site, the bore's water levels actually rose. They didn't fall. They rose 11 centimetres a year under the mallees, and they rose 13 centimetres under their control, and they're not statistically significant. Similar at Tincarron, established 2003, so here only established 7 years. The water tables under the mallees rose at the same rate, roughly, as the control, and again, there's no statistical significance. Similar at Gibson. So when you establish and control recharge, what we've found from both the early 1980s planting all the way through to the recent planting is you have to establish the recharge control over a very large percentage of the catchment to generate the water table control that you end up seeing as risk management. So this talk was entitled a story about how you manage salinity. And one of the conclusions from it is that the adaptation and saltland pasture systems for the marginal saline land is probably at the moment still a very strong option where you can gain economic benefits from the system to be planted. So the preferred approach for valleys at present is to fence and manage the very saline land because it's probably not worth the investment in terms of economic yield, and that country will come back to productivity of some degree. You can also enhance the productivity, and Ed Barrett-Leonard talked about that. The most productive systems are those marginal saline lands where the economic benefits can be realised. For the areas that are not currently saline, but for which there is a real risk, in other words, the water tables are rising, what we've seen some benefit from, and in both putting off the future date of salinity, so deferring it by slowing the water table rise, is to manage recharge in the areas where there's a medium to longer term risk, or where the water table's rising and less than 5 metres, or 5 to 10 metres and still rising. And that system requires recharge reduction using tools like wide-spaced oil mallee alleys, continuous cropping, or some form of perennial. And that's the best way of reducing the rate of rise, which puts off the extent of salinity. We have salinity hazard maps through the land monitor data, and we have monitoring data sets available for you to look at your particular catchment and work out in which catchment you are by the extent and which hazard class you sit in. In terms of the uplands work, at the moment in the low rainfall areas of the wheat belt, the upland work is the second priority, because if you've seen from the modelling, even if you were to control recharge in the uplands, we aren't actually changing very much the risk in the valleys, which have the highest risk in the first place, and they have the majority of the assets, which obviously provide some impetus for us. In my next presentation, we'll talk about some of the control that you can get by managing saltland.